Hi, thank you for joining us once again. My name is Lindsay Marsh, and I am the Senior Associate in charge of our Census project at the National Community Action Partnership. Today we're going to talk about how to talk to populations that are undercounted. So we've titled this webinar, Census 2020, Persuading Undercounted Households to Participate. I'm going to run through this section of our persuasion slide deck and give you the background information on all of the slides and where we're coming from, and hopefully give you some hints and tricks about how to build questions and talk about the material. Let's get started. So one of the first things that we have is this amazing 7-minute video that was put together by the Long Beach Community Action Partnership. The featured person in this video is former Executive Director Derek Simpson. He left Long Beach probably about 6 months ago, but he completed this video for us before he left. Long Beach has a studio associated with their agency, so they were able to put together this for us. I often say that if you have nothing else in your bandwidth to do, send this to staff, send this to the people in your agency, your colleagues, and have them watch it, because in 7 minutes you get a really great overview of what the census means to community action and how to answer some of those really frequently asked questions. I'm hoping that you can do at least a little bit more than that, which is why you're here doing the Train the Trainer. But if not, this is a great place to start. Derek talks through what the census is, why it's important to us, and then answers those frequently asked questions. He also talks about the 3 main ways to fill out the census form, or the 3 preferred ways to fill out the census form, which is online, which is new this year, over the phones, which is also new. You've always been able to call in and ask questions, but now this year you can call in, ask questions, and or fill out your form online, which is really a huge asset for rural America, because rural America often doesn't have solid, reliable internet connections, and they also don't often have reliable mail unless we're talking about a P.O. box, and census forms cannot be delivered to a P.O. box. So something to keep in mind. Let's move on. We have also recently done a series of videos with Lentcap, which is out of Pennsylvania. They did 14 of these shorter videos for us. So the one from Derek Simpson is about 7.5 minutes long. These are all under 2 minutes. And we have English, we have Spanish. They talk about what the census is, why it's important to our communities. We talk about safety and security, especially for those Hispanic populations who might be concerned about the non-existent citizenship question. We talk about children in the census, how you count everyone in your community. These are great to give, to post on social media. These are good to put into a closed circuit television in your lobby, or to show in a waiting room in some way, shape, or form. We designed all of these to answer frequently asked questions and hopefully persuade people to fill out the census form because it means something to their community. So that message research, I talked a little bit about this in the last video that we put together. The full research that has been done by our partners is available online. They're also listed on the bottom of the next few slides. This is the summary page that I put together because looking at all the research, you see that there is a common theme between all of it. And the common theme is that if you tell people that it matters to their community and that by filling out this little simple form that's safe, they can bring resources to their community and do good for their neighbors and the fabric of their community, they're much more likely to fill out the census. And with all of your agencies, it's going to take a little finesse to find out how to frame that message exactly. And some of the next slides we go through will have a little bit more about how to do that with specific groups. But for the most part, overarchingly, if you can tell somebody that the census is safe, it's easy, and it's really important to bring crucial resources to your community, they're going to listen to you, especially because we're trusted messengers. and they're going to listen to your colleagues as well. So the best messaging besides that is that funding for schools, childcare, housing, transportation, you can put in anything that your program, anything your agencies use as programs in that segment. So funding for schools can easily be funding for Head Start or funding for WIC or SNAP benefits or Section 8 housing vouchers. The majority of the programs that our agencies run use some kind of formula that includes census data. And if you're talking to your colleagues, we all do community needs assessments every 3 years. So they use census numbers to do those forms and to do the projections to pick the programs that will best meet the needs of your community for the next 3 years. So if our census numbers are off at the very granular level of your agency, all of your programs will be skewed and you won't be meeting the needs of your community necessarily. I mean, you could look into it or your numbers could be not that far off, but the more accurate of a count we can do in the next 4 months, the better off you will be for 10 years because you will have the resources, more of the resources. I know we never have enough that you need. So the other point I like to mention is that doing the census helps your community get their fair share of resources. I've had people say to me, why are you trying to take money by telling other people to fill out their census forms? What if people cheat on their forms and they put down more people than live in their house? How do you make sure that the census is safe? Is there fraud? Our goal is to make sure that all of our communities are counted accurately because it's democracy. I mean, I call the census the building block of democracy. And if we don't have an accurate count, there's no way for us to have fair representation. And there's no way for our communities to get the fair amount of dollars that they deserve from the federal government for services that they provide. And the services, the things that the census funds, I don't know that I could list them all in a 20-minute webinar. It's everything from highway transportation funding based on, the number of people who live in a city who ride on those roads to Head Start money to educational funding. And it really permeates not just every facet of community action, although it certainly does. It's really our entire community. Anywhere you think that the federal government might not have a hand, they probably do in funding something. And so for me, it comes down to making sure that our agencies get the money that they're due to hopefully help people rise out of poverty. Like that's the goal here. Messaging, other messaging. So only census data can be used for funding decisions and funding formulas. So that's the example of LIHEAP. I use that a lot, but it's true. So the old formula, the new formula for LIHEAP that determines how much money the states get to distribute to their heating and cooling programs through LIHEAP or HEAP or however the low-income home energy assistance program is titled in your state. It matters, and if you count more people, then you will have more resources. And the other message, this most frequently works well with children, but it permeates across them all, is to say that the effects last for a decade. So I often say you miss a 2-year-old, the next census will be when that child is 12. So you have just missed an entire elementary school education. That kid is then, 7th grade, 6th grade, 8th, somewhere in late middle school. You have missed an opportunity to help that kid succeed and be set up for life if you've missed that child. Our school systems are chronically underfunded, and one of the reasons is that we missed 2 million children in last year's census. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's switch the screens. Oh, and did you notice the full research is available online? So it is a link to the funders' research. They posted it and made it public. So if you have questions regarding more in-depth information about any of these groups, you can go look at the research yourself. So the first group we're going to talk about is kids. This research was funded by our broader coalition, but it was carried out by the Count All Kids campaign. And they found that they were confused, like why do kids get left off census forms? Because most often parents will do the census form for themselves, but not actually include their children. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of them is that parents don't understand how the data is used, And so they don't understand that if they don't include their children, their community is missing out on funding, or that that's how school funding is determined in large part. They don't know any of that. They also think that government already has the data, which I mentioned in the last webinar. Is probably true. The government does have a lot of this data, and they have access to ways to confirm what they collect with the census forms out in the field. They cannot use any of that data unless it's filled out onto a form. So it's kind of like going to the polls. If you just stand outside the poll and say, I'm voting for Joe Smith, unless you actually go in and pull that lever, or fill in that Scantron, or return that absentee ballot, or whatever the case may be, if you don't actually do that act, it doesn't matter what you're declaring or what anybody knows about your choice. You have to make that action and actually fill out a ballot. So a lot of people think that government already has the data, and so it doesn't matter if they fill out the census, which couldn't be further from the truth. A lot of parents have privacy concerns. The government doesn't need to know about my kids. Ironically, a lot of those people also take the earned income tax credit. So that's one way to combat that. But privacy concerns permeate throughout all of our groups for the focus research. And it's legit. You know, if you don't understand the workings of the Census Bureau and the integrity and Title 13, which is where all the Census Bureau employees pledge an oath that if they break, they can be jailed for 5 years and or fined $250,000. That's not a joke. It's never been prosecuted because it's such a strong deterrent in the 45, 50 years that it's been in place. Sometime it was in the 70s that they did that. So there are privacy controls in place, but I completely understand why somebody looking at those demographic questions thinking, why does the government need to know about this? The good thing for us is that as community action agencies, we know far more about our customers than just these 10 questions. We know citizenship status for LIHEAP. We know income levels for LIHEAP. And I mean, they're in TANF, and there are lots of programs where the demographic questions from the census are pure child's play. It's not a big deal. And the form is really short. This is the short version. There used to be a long form and a short form. Now there's just the short form. That's what we've got. And so there's also a lot of misinformation because people remember that long form. People think they're too busy. Going back to the question of 10 questions for 10 years, it'll take you less than 10 minutes is the framework of that one. Fear goes back to privacy concerns. People are worried that their landlords will find out that they have 5 people in a house where they should have 4 for their section on housing voucher. The answer there is that all of these forms the information is used in aggregate, but the forms themselves are held private until the year 2092. And if you're worried about your middle-aged landlord figuring out in 2092 that you have too many people in your house, I want to know what magic youth pill you've got, because chances are pretty good that in 72 years that your landlord will be dead. So there are ways to dispatch all of these fears, but I'm also trying to talk a little bit about the background of them. Complex households is how 80% of our kids get missed. These are the grandparents who take care of their grandchildren who think mom and dad should do that. That's not my responsibility. Foster parents sometimes don't realize that they should count their foster children because they believe those kids belong to someone else. And that might be the case, but they live with you. And so in that instance, you include everyone who is living or staying in your home without another home. So your couch surfing friend who's between apartments, if they're staying with you on April 1st, then they should be counted on your form. Those complex households include divorced parents where the kids shuttle between households. Technically, wherever the kids spend April 1st is where they should be counted, is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is whoever takes the earned income tax credit for the kids, and or wherever the kids spend more than 50% of their time. If it's an even split, you got to talk to your former spouse or former partner and figure out who's going to count the kids. But that's how 80% of those kids get missed. The form is also, the paper form only has spaces for 10 people. So if you have an 11-person household, the way most people do this, which is probably just human nature, they go with the oldest person first and they work their way down the age list. And so that's how babies get missed. Because if you've got a 2-month-old and it's the 11th person in your household, you're not going to get to that kid. That's why the census questionnaire asks how many people lived in your household on April 1st. So if you answer 12, but you only had space for 10 people on the written form, the Census Bureau can follow up with you and say, who are those other 2 people? Let's talk about that. So that's another way that these kids are missed. So how do you convince a parent who thinks the government doesn't need to know about their kid to fill out the form and include those children? Resources your community needs, and you name the programs that they engage with their children are dependent on counting everybody. And again, effects last for a decade, which is most of their childhood. When these messages were given to parents who were initially suspicious or unsure that they were going to fill out the census, they moved people. So counting children means more funding for schools. If you say that to a parent who's waffling, 82% go from not including their children to including their children. Helps government plan for the future, government program services, child care, housing. Again, 82% moved from not including their children to including their children. And then that message of missing out on childhood also moved 81%. Next, the Color of Change organization did focus groups and surveys with African Americans. For the most part, 35 and older, African Americans understand the census, they know the importance, they participate, they do their civic duty, and they're good. Black millennials, on the other hand, are a target audience for them for a wide variety of reasons. Some are on the next slide, but they're going to talk, they're least likely to recognize the importance and say they'll participate. So they don't know how the census data is used. So there's a misinformation, there's an education piece here. They don't know how it impacts their communities. And I will mention, I don't always bring this up in some of our webinars and our meetings, but African Americans are disproportionately affected by the jail situation in this country. They are, I think it's 20% more likely to be incarcerated. African American men are far and away incarcerated at a much higher rate than any other ethnicity. Jails, I mean, if you're in a federal penitentiary, you are counted in the county where that jail exists. You aren't counted at home. You are counted in whatever small community. Usually there's small rural communities. I can think of one that's up near Accord, New York, near Poughkeepsie, New York. There's not much around there, but there is this jail. And so, that's how that community survives, because they get the federal funding for all of the inmates. What that does, though, it might help that small upstate New York community where there's a prison. But it means that wherever those men, often African-American men, are incarcerated, their home neighborhood is missing out on not only their dollars, but their federal representation. There are congressional districts where a large percentage of the constituents of that congressman are inmates who cannot vote. So it feels like an injustice to me, in part because my guess is that the communities that those men came from really need the money to help rise people out of poverty and to eradicate crime. So I don't talk about that a lot because I don't want it to seem political. I don't feel like it is. I think it's just a fact of how the census works. But that's one of the reasons why millennial African American men are a really important target group for us. Because it's all the more important that the African American men and women and children, that African American community members who are not incarcerated are counted in their home areas and their communities, because they need every dollar of funding that they can get, because they're already disproportionately affected by the mass incarceration of Black men. Okay, so how do you get these millennial African American men to participate? You have to dissuade them of the notion, first of all, that the census doesn't matter to them, and that a lot of them think that the census data can be gained somewhere else. And again, it can be, it's just not useful. So telling them that it has an impact on their communities, especially when you mention funding for Medicaid and food stamps, that's something that really gets them to pay attention. and be more likely to fill out that form to help their community. The greatest potential to convert, which means persuade them from not filling it out, not caring, to caring, is to demonstrate the impact that the census has on their communities by mentioning specific programs. Very compelling reason. So the top messages for African Americans is that it's about $20,000 per person overall average in the state in funding for the next 10 years. So you getting counted brings $20,000 of resources to your community. Huge message. I mentioned this, yeah, if the government doesn't obtain the information via the census form, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count. They can't backfill that information just because they have it elsewhere. That's just not how the census works. They also feel like it's really intrusive, not as intrusive as a TANF form, as a LIHEAP form. Ensuring funding for programs in my community is the most persuasive message for all African Americans. Okay, next we're going to talk about Hispanic and Latino communities. So I think I've mentioned this before, but perhaps it was another webinar. The citizenship question will not be on the census. And yet a lot of people in Hispanic communities across the country are still very worried about it. I was definitely expecting the citizenship question to come back up in the news around the same time as the census begins. Now with the coronavirus, COVID-19, we'll see. I'm not really sure what's going to happen, but I was pretty convinced that it was going to pop back up just to fear monger and to try to convince those populations to not fill out the census form. And there are a wide variety of reasons. I don't want to speculate as to why this was made a political football, but that's what it was. And as the building block of our democracy, the census should not be a political football. We want everyone to matter equally in this country. That's what we were founded on. So Hispanic communities have a lot of hesitation, fear, and cynicism, in part because they still believe that the citizenship question will be on there. But it's not the right approach to tell somebody, there's no citizenship question, because when you bring it up like that, it highlights it, it causes alarm, it allows alarm bells to ring. If you couch it instead in a list, the research has proven that it sinks in a little bit better and doesn't sink in negatively. So if you say, the only demographic questions, name, address, name, age, race, relationship status, gender. You may mention the things that are on the census, and then you say there are a lot of things that aren't on the census too. And you say your social security number isn't asked. They don't ask for bank information. They don't ask for citizenship status, political affiliation. They don't ask for money. If you couch it in there, they'll pick up on it, but without the alarm bells. And so it's a more effective way of not highlighting the fact, because that could actually backfire. They also, this ties into it, the citizenship question is all about privacy. That's what people are afraid of. And again, they're worried that they're going to get themselves deported or somebody that they love deported. And citizens who are naturalized are worried that their citizenship will be stripped from them. We've also seen some American-born Hispanics that have been incarcerated and questioned just based on the color of their skin. So there's a real fear in the immigrant community, specifically Hispanic populations, that are due to the political environment of today. Data will be kept private. Data will be kept confidential. This is also interesting. Survey respondents often for Hispanics said that the paper form was more comfortable for them than doing it online. I'm not exactly sure why. I couldn't figure that out from the research, but that's interesting. So the Census Bureau is probably sending a lot of Hispanic communities paper forms in their first mailing instead of just doing an invitation to go online and to go call and do your census form. They're probably getting the option to do it on paper as well. 40% said that going online wasn't convenient. It could be because they don't have computers at home. Their computer is their cell phone. It could be because they don't have internet or they don't know how to use a computer. Lots of reasons we're not questioning. We just know that that's the case. And none of them really want, 64% don't want a Census Bureau employee coming to their door. We will see what happens with the COVID-19 situation. I'm not sure how the Census Bureau is going to be able to adjust for the current healthcare crisis that looks like it's getting worse. And we'll keep everybody up to date on that. One of the biggest takeaways from this Latino research is that bringing it up at all moves people from not going to fill it out to far more likely to fill it out, regardless of what the message was. And so let's talk about these messages for a minute. Convenient, so telling them online, over the phone, paper form, easy, really easy, only 10 questions. Safe, somewhere burying the lead on the citizenship question off and talking about the safety protocols. People can't talk about personal private information without going to jail. The forms are kept under lock and key for the next 72 years. Also saying that it's required. A lot of Hispanics, contrary to popular belief, fill out taxes because if they can demonstrate that they have paid taxes for the past 5 years that they've been an undocumented immigrant in this country, they believe that that might help them towards the path towards citizenship. So telling a lot of Hispanics that it is required by law to fill out actually does help them understand the importance of it and move towards filling it out because they want to be good citizens even if they're not citizens yet. That also tells into community duty. Talking about funding, a lot of their kids are American, even if they are not. And so their kids are in schools. And so talking about how that impacts their community. And when the resistance to send community messaging has been a little convoluted. But what they mean by that is they don't want us to be counted. So we will stand up and be counted. That's what that means. So we're going to defend our community. We're going to be visible. We won't be erased. All of those sorts of things come into that play. If you mention any of those messages to any Hispanic Latino family household that is not sure they're going to fill out the census, they will become more likely to fill out just by virtue of hearing any of those. That being said, safe, convenient, and required show the most positive response. And the key part of that is that they protect your data. People are really concerned about that. Messages about the role of census data in providing funding for local schools. Again, their kids, their family members are often American citizens, even if they are not. So making sure that you're talking about the investment in the community is really important. 75% said that they would definitely participate in response to the message that it was convenient and safe and required. The other interesting thing about the Hispanic community is that women really lead the way here. So if you talk to women and convince women in the community, especially if you can find an influencer, the neighborhood matriarch, the church leader who's a woman, if you convince that person to talk to people in your community, then you're far more likely to have a positive response. So women like the civic and community duty message, don't let them erase us. 57% were more likely to respond. Latinos under 40 also liked the message about resistance. We'll be counted because they don't want us to be. They're trying to erase us, that kind of a thing. Family members are the most trusted messengers. And in Latino culture, family members are a broader group than most white American cultures, like the family that I came from would be. So that's a positive for us. Nurses, doctors, healthcare providers in the Latino community also highly recommended. If you're smart enough to be a doctor, you know what you're talking about when it comes to this stuff. And teachers. So it's important that we look at Head Start programs. One of our latest pieces is a coloring page on one side, and on the back side, it has information for parents and guardians. And the idea is that you give it to a kid at a Head Start school, the kid colors it and takes it home to their parent and guardian, and there's information on the back. We have that in English, we have that in Spanish. So please try to find that resource. We can send you printed copies. You can also download it off of our website. For the most part, and I will not say this is all, but for the most part, elected officials were among the least trusted and reliable source of information in the Latino and Hispanic community. That is not a given. That is not across the board. In general, you know your own community. So if you know that the local mayor is revered as a hero, but by all means have him be a messenger. This is just an overall precaution that in general during the survey, this was found that they weren't the most reliable. So the top messages: any message is better than none. Safe, easy, important. The no citizenship question couched. And talking about those three strong protections. Something else I often don't mention in our webinars that I'm revealing to you and the behind the scenes apparently. The Census Bureau took a lot of these precautions in the 1970s because of their actions in the 1940s. So in the 1940s, the Census Bureau was responsible for pulling lists of Americans with Japanese heritage that led to the internment camps. In the 70s, they came out and said, mea culpa, that was wrong. We were wrong to do that. That was a breach of public trust. We should not have done that, and we are going to make it far more difficult for us to do that by passing these measures. So that's where that came from, which is one of the reasons why I trust it, frankly, because they saw what it did to erode public trust, and maybe it took them 20 years to figure out that people no longer trusted the Census Bureau with their private information for them to make these changes to make it secure for us today. And then there's a typo in that slide under fair. So fair share funding for local schools and community programs. Again, that message hits, and I'll fix that typo. Asian Americans. So only two-thirds say that they will be likely to participate. This group strongly prefers those paper forms and online options to the phone or in person. They don't want somebody coming to their door. The phone, I think part of them are, they're worried that there's not going to have somebody who speaks that language. There are a couple of Asian languages on the phones, but not a lot. Mandarin, there's Cantonese, there are two versions of Chinese. I think the Vietnamese and maybe Japanese are some of the languages, but they prefer paper and online. The messaging for this group is that the Census Help gets our community their fair share of resources. That is key to equality. Equality is the key. So that's the messaging here, and this was done by the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. So this is a chart that talks about all the reasons that they tested for why somebody would participate. So if you said, please tell me if this is a very important, an important, a not so important, not important at all, they try to give you a 5-point scale of how each of these would rank and how each of these statements would make you feel about participating in the census. So 73% total felt that it was very important or important that your community gets its fair share of resources as a reason. So that moves a lot of people. My community needs resources and government services, pretty much the same sentence rephrased, slightly different importance, 72 versus 73. It's key to equality for all people here. Again, some of these are the best testing messages. It's an important way to stand up for our community. So you see that also with Hispanics, don't erase us, and we'll see that again with Native Americans, which is the next slide, don't erase us. I'm surprised that message didn't pop a little bit more with the African American community, to be honest. And it's an important way to stand up for our community. Again, stand up for Asians, be counted, say that we're here. I'm going to say it wrong. I think it was Representative Ilhan from Michigan who was talking to the Census Bureau chief, and they wanted them to have a MENA category this year, Middle Eastern Near Africa descent category under race, and the Census Bureau declined to do that. Instead, they're lumping Middle Easterners under white. And Rep. Ilhan said, do I look white to you? I'm not. And yet there won't be research on our populations because we won't be a category that you can discern data from in the statistical database of America for April 1st, 2020. And that's a real thing. I mean, if you don't have these populations to be able to run some of these statistical analysis on populations, then you can't segment and you can't make extrapolations. So if you're looking at, let's say, one of the things I love are the nerdy things that come out from the census. So the census data allows us to say that maybe in 1950, and I'm making this up, a woman who was 22 was most likely to be married and have 2 kids. whereas today in 2020, a woman who's 22 is most likely to be unmarried with no children. That's a basic statistic for America. But if you don't have these groups, if you don't have enough people represented in these groups, then you can't make extrapolations for different populations. And it could be very interesting to know that white Americans in 1950 at 22 were married with 2 children. Black women who were 22 in 1950 were also usually married with 2 kids in 1950, and how that has changed. Maybe it's the case that at 22 in 2020, African Americans are now unmarried with 1 child, whereas white women are unmarried with no children. Those statistical differences, you can't extrapolate if we don't have a big enough sample. And if we cannot count people, if people don't include themselves in that database, they will be erased from those data points. Long-winded way to say it's really important that these people participate because of that. But that's one way to frame it to them, is that we need to make sure that they're not invisible. My voice needs to be heard, my civic duty, all of these things. Legally required by the Constitution, kind of a dud. But saying it's my civic duty, again, it's the same message, just slightly different. So the higher the number, the more important these are, and the more they resonate with the population. Okay, and now top messages for Asian American communities: make sure our communities get resources, critical to our children's future and the next generation. I heard through the census somehow that Asian American food restaurants are slowly declining in number in America. And that's partially because Asian immigrants came to America. They raised children who were Asian Americans. They pushed them to be their very best. And so those kids, instead of coming home and running the mom and pop Chinese food store, are doctors. So that's really interesting, but it also means that these immigrants came here to find a better future for their children. And so our children's future and the next generation is a really powerful message to them. It helps people get the services that they need: healthcare, transportation, schools, affordable housing, and higher education for them to be successful. 79% of Asian Americans moved from "I'm not going to fill out the survey" to "I will participate in the census" when they heard that message. So it's the same thing for this group. Census makes our community gets its fair share. My community needs these resources, and it's the key for equality for people here. Very interesting stuff. I used to be a pollster, if you can tell. This used to be my thing. Okay, Native Americans, also fascinating. Native Americans have no reason to trust the U.S. government whatsoever. And I'm not even talking about smallpox blankets. I'm talking about modern day. Native American communities feel like they have been overlooked and overshadowed in every which way by the American government for centuries. So it's no surprise that they're not necessarily interested in filling out this form. They're very suspicious of anything that has to do with the U.S. government. And one of the reasons they're really concerned that they're concerned about privacy. Native American populations want to know what it's for, what it's going to do, how it will benefit their community. If I give you this information, what's it going to do for me? And so that's something we have to tell them. There is a history of betrayal. That's what I just talked about. Low awareness of purpose. People don't know what it does. And the sad thing is that so many of these tribes rely so heavily on our agencies for basic necessities. So it is super, super, super important that these tribes get counted. And I know that there are some tribes that are really, really active in making sure that a repeat of 2010, where a lot of Native Americans were not counted, doesn't happen again. There is also a lack of delivery on previous claims, because sometimes, A, we've lied to them as an American government. B, sometimes it's hard to see. It's like people who picket a Democratic president saying, "Keep your hands off my Medicare." They don't seem to understand it's a program. It's a federal program. They think that it's not hands off. anyway, my point is that people don't always understand how the world works for a variety of reasons. So I digress. Here, it's my civic duty is one of the most compelling things. My community needs resources and government programs is another really compelling. Legally required by the Constitution, though, not the same, least compelling. Nobody really cares about the Constitution on these tribes because they're autonomous nations. But it's my civic duty resonates in a different way. These quotes really blow me away. We speak for the generations of Native people before us and for those yet to come. Really powerful. Erasure is a really, really, really big issue for tribes. Filling out the census ensures our community is counted, heard, and visible. You cannot silence us. You cannot erase us. Really, really, really important and most compelling. So the key themes, we want to garner more resources, and we want to raise the visibility of Native Americans. Legacy statements related to honoring the past generations, contributing to a future. Cat, you're not losing your mind. There's a cat behind me. The joys of working from home sometimes. So the legacy statements honoring past generations, again, we have been erased before. We have been mistreated. This is a way for us to say we are here and we deserve and command volume and numbers. And all of this was done by the National Congress of American Indians. The top messaging, critical to fund our community programs. You have to tell them what community programs are impacted by this funding. That's what makes a difference. Help our Native communities be seen. Confidentiality is a big deal here too. So talking about those safety, these are the same 3 safety points prohibited by law from sharing anything but aggregated data. The Title 13 pledge of $250,000 or 5 years in jail if you reveal personal information, and then the forms are kept private. And again, civic duty, not constitutional. So often with this slide, I use it as a way to start a conversation with the people I'm training. So I throw out questions. Okay, what would you do if somebody in your community was afraid to fill out the census? Like, where do you go from there? Like, if somebody just says to you, oh, the census, I'm afraid to fill it out, what would you start with? And we would just give you a bunch of information, frontline staff member, how do you start? And we banter around, you have a conversation. A, it helps get people's minds moving and helping them think about what they might say in that situation. B, it's a way for people to say the answers out loud, and that helps them remember what they've just learned. So it's twofold. If somebody didn't think that the census impacted them, okay, I want you to think about how this is going to impact your community. What are the programs that are most impactful in your area? How do I convey that if they fill out the census, the Head Start program that their 2 little kids are in really can thrive? I mean, they'll be given the tools for to set them up for life. That's kind of what I'm thinking of there. Someone struggles with forms. There are ways for us to help them. We cannot, and I know that this has changed since I started this work almost a year ago, from we can't help people fill out forms due to privacy concerns to an about face where we certainly can help people fill forms out. We do it all the time, as we should. We cannot take information we know without permission from the person whose information it is. So if you know that Joe Smith isn't going to fill out the census, you can't go online and fill it out for him. That being said, if Joe Smith comes in and you fill out a form with him for something else, you can say, hey, let's do your census form now together. I'll help you, and walk him through the process. That's totally fine. Somebody doesn't have good internet or mail service, they can call the Census Bureau, which is what I recommend, and that's the answer that I'm looking for there. I want people to talk it through to figure out how to do that in their area. And then I have some Q&As, and I prom them up. So the first slide says, why is the census important? I let people think about it. I let people throw the answers out, and then I reveal the answer. That's how these are all set up. It said $2,000 per person. Do I participate if I'm not a citizen? Yes, you certainly do. And it gives the reasons why. That's how these are all set up. Do they come to my house? No, they probably won't if you fill it out completely and early. I will not promise, and you should not, that no one will come to your house. We'll see what happens with the epidemic. I have no idea how that's going to play out yet. But I will say that if you fill out the census early and completely, you are far less likely to have somebody come to your house. They might for quality assurance, and with the epidemic, it might be that they do phone calls instead of quality assurance in-home visits. I don't know yet, and we won't know for a while yet. But it does make it more likely that someone will not show up at your door if you fill out the survey early. And in light of the epidemic, we are pushing everybody to self-respond. It's called self-respond when you fill out the form online, over the phone, or in the mail, when the mail form comes to you. Is it safe? We've gone over these 3 points. Yes. Can I help someone? I've already talked about this. You can certainly help somebody fill out their form. Accessibility issues. The Census Bureau has a hard of hearing phone line, so you can use that. They also have Braille forms that you can get through your Complete Count Committee, which is addressed in another webinar. So a local partnership specialist or your Complete Count Committee can help you with that stuff. There's also one of our partners is I'm going to get it wrong, it's a disability group, and they have a lot of materials to, help you talk to people with disabilities. So if you have a learning disability and you read it at 3rd grade level, they have materials that are written in 3rd grade English, so you can help work with those folks. They also have other resources available. And then I talk about our social media. I always want people to amplify the message, especially in the day and age that we find ourselves in with COVID-19. Face-to-face outreach is getting to be rarer and rarer, I feel. And so the real way to get this done is to promote it online as often as we possibly can. And I know that doesn't do any good for rural districts. There you should reach out to your local radio stations and ask them to read a PSA. And we have some 15, 30, and 60-second PSAs that the Census Bureau wrote that are quick and easy and timed for that you can just ask them, hey guys, be really meaningful for our community if you would read this on air. So you can certainly do that. And I encourage people to sign up for our newsletter. Anyone I train gets signed up for our newsletter somehow. We collect collect email addresses and add them so people get information. And we want people to join our Facebook group. So if they're interested in doing census work, they can join the group to find real-time answers and stay up to date on the changes that are happening because of the epidemic. And then I talk about action steps. You might not be talking about nominating people for the CACCC. You are likely to be the CACCC member. And you might not be having them reach out to partnership specialists. I left this in there because I want you to be able to create the PowerPoint that's right for you and your agency. They are still recruiting as of mid-March for census jobs. Again, we'll see what happens in the next few months. I have no idea what's going to happen, but they are still taking applications. And we do have materials to help. So if you need stuff, please do let us know. I leave it open for questions. And I always end with our resource links so people can read more on our website or our coalition partners website. And then I give them my email address and say, please email me for additional information. And that's how we do it. Thanks for watching.